you. I'm Walter Isaacson, the president of the Aspen Institute, and one of the great joys of being president of the Aspen Institute is that occasionally you get invited to sit in with the Aspen Strategy Group with my friends Strobe and Angela and Steve, and of course run by Nick Burns. The crisis with Russia every day takes another step, but these are the people best adept at dealing with it. In fact, the Aspen Strategy Group was started 30 years ago with really the crises in Russia in mind. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nick Burns, the director of the Aspen Strategy Group and a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Thanks, Nick, for doing this.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you here to the Aspen Institute. This is the Washington Ideas Roundtable series, and the first thing I want to do is thank Michelle Smith and the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation for making this possible. I also want to recognize some important guests in the room. We have 4 ambassadors from allied countries. We have the ambassador of Finland, the ambassador of Estonia, the ambassador of Latvia, and the ambassador of Denmark. We also have 3 former members of Congress, Jim Moody, Jim Slattery, and Jim Walsh. And it's always perilous in a room like this to recognize special friends, but we have 2 special friends given the topic, which is the crisis with Russia over Ukraine. Ambassador Jim Collins, who is extraordinarily effective American ambassador to Russia, longtime Russia specialist, and a great friend to all of us on this panel. And Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer, who is ambassador to Ukraine, longtime Russia-Ukraine specialist. I think all of us have worked with Steve as well, and so congratulations to both of them, and thank you for being here. What we're going to do today is talk about one of the major strategic challenges to the United States in 2014. President Putin's invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Duma, the consistent efforts by President Putin and the Russian government to destabilize eastern Ukraine over the last 9 months, and the reaction by the West, by the United States, Canada, and Europe, and by the NATO countries, the sanctions, the building up of American and NATO power in the Baltic countries, in Poland and Romania, and the standoff that continues to this day. We do that based on a book that we are publishing today, and I think all of you have copies, and for those of you on C-SPAN, and C-SPAN is televising this event, this is a book published by the Aspen Strategy Group about the crisis with Russia. The Aspen Strategy Group, in its 30th year, met in early August in Aspen, Colorado, as we do every year, to take on a big subject. And this year, this nonpartisan group, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, mostly Americans, but joined by several European and Asian leaders, met to discuss what the West should do in response. And I do commend this book to you. It contains a lead essay by Strobe Talbott. I'll introduce Strobe in a minute, who gave the Ernest May Memorial Lecture. He tried to frame this issue in historical terms and in terms of the evolution of Russia's path since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. It contains essays by many other Americans and Europeans. How do we think about this crisis? What are President Putin's motivations and strategic ambitions? Has the West reacted significantly and effectively? What are the implications for global energy? What are the implications for China and China's relationship with Russia and the West? And so we'll talk today about these issues, but I do want to commend this book to you. I'd ask you to tweet about it. I'd ask you to, if you have an interest in it, purchase it on Amazon. That helps to fund the expenses of this nonprofit organization. Our leaders are Brent Scowcroft, who does not need an introduction to this room, and Joe Nye. And for 30 years, they've been of the opinion that Americans should be able to have serious discussions about the major international challenges to us in a nonpartisan environment. And that's what they've created, and that's what we celebrate today. We're going to have a discussion for about the next 30 to 40 minutes with 3 panelists. Strobe Talbott, president of the Brookings Institution, and as all of you know, served as Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, lifelong expert on Russia, has been interested in Russia since he was a very young man, and we'll ask Strobe a series of questions about how he sees the crisis with Russia. Angela Stent, to my right, professor at Georgetown University, longtime Soviet and Russia expert, has also served at the National Intelligence Council for the U.S. government. And finally, Steve Hadley. Steve has worked in the Ford administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, and of course, as you know, in the George W. Bush administration, and that latter administration as National Security Advisor. Steve has dealt with the Soviets and Russians since the 1970s, and so has a long perspective, as do Angela and Strobe, on all these issues. And there's a fourth person, Steve Began, who was a big part of our discussions, because Steve knows a lot about Russia, served with great distinction in the George W. Bush administration, now Vice President of Ford Motor Company. And so I want to thank Steve for all of his support, intellectual and otherwise, to make this happen. So without further ado, we'll have a conversation and go through a series of questions to try to get to the heart of this crisis. Once we've finished, I want to invite all of you to offer your point of view and to ask the most challenging questions you can think of for this distinguished panel. Let me start, perhaps, Strobe, with you. Strobe, you kicked off our Aspen Strategy Group 4 days together in Colorado and tried to give us an historical framework so that we could understand the motivations of President Putin and the Russian leadership, both their relationship with us, but also, more importantly, their relationship with Ukraine and the other former republics of the Soviet Union. And I wanted to ask you, and I'll pose the same question to Angela and Steve, now that we've seen at the end of 2014 how shaken confidence is between the West and the Russian leadership, and the dramatic impact it's had, negative, on our relationship, how serious a crisis is this, and do you believe we'll be able to contain it?
Very serious in 3 dimensions. With regard to Russia itself, I think there is an all too plausible scenario whereby what we have seen, particularly over the last year, but also in the run-up to not just the annexation of Crimea, but the virtual occupation and pseudo-annexation of much of eastern Ukraine, will be a catalyst for a process over time that will greatly weaken the Russian state and could even lead to the Russian state going the way of the USSR, which is exactly the opposite, of course, of what President Putin has in mind. He intends this to be a show of Russian strength in the face of what he regards as Western weakness. But the essence of his policies, both domestic and foreign, are essentially a resurrection of the policies that caused the USSR. You may all recall there was once a very large state called the USSR to end up on the trash heap of history. And that would be an ironic and, by the way, a very dangerous outcome for the whole world. This is not to wish for something bad for Russia, it's to fear something bad for the world. Second, it's unquestionably a crisis for the Western community, the Atlantic community, which up until a few years ago was moving in a direction that involved the integration of the Russian Federation itself as well as its neighbors into an expanded international community that would be playing by the same rules, that would have certain norms in common, and that would lead to not just a peaceful 21st century, but also a 21st century in which Russia would be not just have a seat at the board of directors of the world, but would be a collaborative and cooperative power. And what we're looking at now is, I think, a non-trivial set of conflicts and potential conflicts, including on the periphery, other than Ukraine itself, that could lead to armed conflict. And here I'm particularly concerned about 3 NATO member states that had been constituent republics of the USSR, namely the Baltic states, even though the U.S. and others in the West had never accepted their annexation under the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And the last crisis, I think, is for a positive future for the process of globalization. We cannot have a salutary system, international system, if Russia is not part of it. It is simply too important, both in its size and its clout and its ability to be either obstructive or helpful in dealing with the big issues of our time.
Strobe, thank you. And Angela, maybe I could just ask you the same question, but ask you to, I'll expand it a little bit. You're a longtime Putin watcher, and you've written about Putin, about his motivations. What does he want? What is he trying to achieve strategically by this very big move into both Crimea and to destabilize a major state in the central part of Europe?
Well, it's always a question, what does he want to achieve? But really, when you listen to him and when you see what Russia's doing, we know what they don't want. So let me just agree with what Strobe said. I think this is the worst crisis in relations with Russia since before Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. And I think when you go back to Putin and what he wants is this is the culmination of, probably from his point of view, at least 22 years or 25 years of frustration, of feelings of humiliation. After all, we remember he was in the GDR serving as a KGB officer in Dresden when the wall came down, seeing all of that happen, coming back to the Soviet Union, having then lost his country, and feeling, if one is to believe what he says, that for the past 22 years Russia has suffered a series of humiliations. So I sat there a few weeks ago when he delivered his 3-hour bromide against the United States in Sochi, and then was also present at other discussions with other officials. And it's quite clear that the message they want to convey is that they will no longer accept the rules of world order that they claim were defined by the United States and imposed on them, and do not take their interests into account. And so this is broader than Ukraine. I really think that Russia, or some people in Russia at least, I think the president himself believes that Russia is at war with the West, that Russia is behaving more like a revisionist power now, again, calling into question the post-Cold War settlement and making legal arguments for what it did in Ukraine by referring back to other things that have happened in the past 22 years, but again saying they're double standards and we need a new world order. Now, I'm not sure that the Russians actually know what this new world order should be, but I think we have to take seriously when we look to the future that there will probably be other areas where Russia will believe that it can reinterpret the rules. We already see the resumption of a lot of Cold War tactics in terms of harassing air routes. They're going to be long-range, bomber flights to the Gulf of Mexico, all these kinds of tactics that look as if it's the Cold War, although, of course, it's not the Cold War. But I think we're this is a broader question of how does world order continue? And of course, that affects the process of globalization, too.
Thank you very much. Steve Hadley, you were present at all or nearly all of the significant meetings that President George W. Bush had over 8 years with President Putin. There were times when, just after 9/11, President Putin was in many ways a friend to the United States. There were times, the Iraq War, when he was very much opposed to us. Knowing him, or at least getting a sense of his worldview, do you agree with Angela about what his motivations are, and how do you see the crisis that's developed?
I would defer to Strobe and Angela, but I think Putin has moved over time. I think when he started out, he thought, as he said, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. I think he meant that sincerely. I think early on when he came to power, he thought there wasn't much he could do about it. He had a very small economy and not great prospects. And I think we also made a pitch during the first administration to try to convince him that his legacy would be to move Russia permanently into the West and to integrate it with Europe, where Russia always should have been. And we spent 4 years trying to find various ways to convince him that this was his calling. And his people, who, and I dealt with them, we had a strategic dialogue that I managed with my counterpart. And the word we got was, yes, Putin understands this is his historical opportunity, but there are dark forces in Russia, and you have to let him do it his own way. And I think as he saw an opportunity to split with us on Iraq and make common cause with the Germans and the French, as they made some smart fiscal decisions in their administration as the price of oil went up, he became stronger and decided he had perhaps more options. I think we don't really know. I think one of the things we learned from Georgia is that he's a real opportunistic person. He sees opportunities, he seizes them, and if he succeeds and is not resisted, his objectives grow over time. And I think that's what we face here. So where are we now? One, he's already ripped up the post-Cold War consensus on Europe. That is to say, borders would be respected, sovereignty would be respected, force would not be used, and countries could choose their own alliances. Well, he has ripped up all of those. Second, I think his objective is to keep Ukraine weak, divided, on the hope that it is not permanently been lost, but that after a period of time, after a lot of pressure and failure of the state and inadequate help from the West, Ukrainians maybe 2, 3, 4 years from now will decide the Crimeans were right. And maybe it's better if we move east, not west. Clearly, I think that's on his agenda. The question is whether, if he succeeds, does his objectives become more extensive? He's already doing a lot of things in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary to try to put divisions within the EU, to weaken the EU. I think if he does this kind, as Strobe mentioned, this kind of destabilization campaign in a place like the Baltic states, it'll be to show that Article 5 in NATO and the defense commitment doesn't mean anything, isn't worth the paper it's written on, which will be a blow to the willingness of countries in Europe to stand up to him. And with the bottom line, the big payoff for him would be if he could reestablish Russian influence in the former Soviet space and in Central and Eastern Europe, comparable to what the Soviet Union had. This is not sending in troops in occupation. This is influence. So these states have to take into account, and do take into account, Russian interests, Russian desires. To me, that's, if you asked him what is his dream, that might be it. That might be it. And that's a kind of Europe that I think would be bad for Europe, bad for us, and ultimately bad for Russia, because I think while it vindicate Russian nationalism and feed their ego, I think it's not sustainable over the long term, and it takes Russia away from what its real objective should be, which is to become part of the 21st century.
Steve, thank you. We want to get to whether or not the West, Europe, Canada, North America have been effective in trying to counter Putin. But before we do, I think there's two questions to put on the table very briefly. And the first is this. I don't want to lead the witnesses, but when you encounter Russians, and I have in many international conferences over the last 7 or 8 months, the line sometimes is, you Americans drove us to this. It was the expansion of NATO in 1997 and 2002 when you took in 10 countries into NATO, 3 of which had been constituent parts of the Soviet Union. This is the Russian line. You drove us to this. It was your aggressiveness. I don't agree with that at all. But I wonder how one should respond to that. I think I know how, but we've all had this question. Any misgivings about what most of us on this panel were involved in the Clinton and Bush administrations? That poor, sensitive soul, Putin, did we hurt his feelings too much and drive him to this?
You're looking at me, Nick. It's passing strange that the debate over the expansion of NATO would be once again in the forefront of controversy, not just between those of us in the West, which, by the way, is a geographical term that we thought was expanding to include many in the East. But it's also back as a point of controversy here in the U.S., and particularly among those of us who are either, you can call us the wonkery or the elite, the foreign policy elite. The original rationale for expanding NATO to include countries who had either been released from the prison house of nations by the reformist government of Gorbachev, or were released from the prison house of nations, which was the USSR, not by some plot from the West, but by reformist leaders driven by public opinion inside the USSR, that that would end the bifurcation of the world between the free world and the communist world, and there could be institutions that would, among other things, provide security, including in partnership with former republics of the USSR and former members of the Warsaw Pact. Now, here we are, and by the way, that rationale was accepted by the Russian government at the time, and there were some very significant episodes of collaboration, particularly in ending the mayhem in the Balkans, that I think would not have happened, or at least would have been much more difficult and taken a much more longer time if it had not been for Russian participation. And so all of those positives had created a movement towards what I think has now been not just stopped, but put into reverse. There was always, with the expansion of NATO, what Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense at the time, called the hedge factor, and that is it was possible that someday in the future Russia might break bad. And that, too, was a reason why all of the countries that were taken into NATO, which I think represents something like 100 million Europeans now, have the protection of NATO. And before we even get to the Russian complaint, the notion that the West created this problem is kind of turning what I think are the facts on their head. Imagine how the Poles would feel now if they were not in NATO. It's a counterfactual, but I would guess that were the three Baltic states not member states of NATO, you wouldn't have just little green men creating mischief in those countries. You'd probably also have Russian boots on the ground. Let me just stop with that on that one point that you raised.
And I would just add, and Steve and I worked together on this when we took the 7 new countries into NATO at the Prague Summit in November 2002. The Russians were very unhappy, but we had lots of conversations with President Putin and his staff, and we created the NATO-Russia Council subsequent to that. And we began to work with Russia. The Russians had an ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, at Brussels, and we tried to work with them on the big security issues. So we didn't try to exclude Russia from security conversations. We tried to bring them in. It didn't work out so well. I wanted to ask Angela and Steve, the second question is, Stephen, you mentioned it. Do you think President Putin may intend to confront NATO in the Baltic states? You mentioned that at least theoretical possibility. Would he try any initiative that would weaken NATO's Article 5 commitment in the next year or two? Is it possible?
It's possible. It would, I think, depend on his calculation of the risk-reward trade-off. It's one of the reasons why I've always thought we need to have him fail in Ukraine so he won't be tempted to try to do something in the Baltics, because I do think that risks war in Europe. Who would have thought we'd be talking about war in Europe? So that's why I think our policy needs to be strengthened. I think we have focused too much on sanctions. I understand why we have done that, but they have some unfortunate effects. They encourage the Russians. One, they weaken the Russian economy, and you can decide whether you think that's good for Russian sense of itself and its foreign policy. It also encourages it to de-integrate its economy into with Europe and the rest of the world. I don't think that's good for Russia. I don't think that's, for the reasons Strobe said, that's good for stability over the long term. And I think, thirdly, the Russians have made it clear that they are prepared to accept historically, accept economic hardship in the interest of a dream of Russian greatness. So I think we are underplaying other elements of our influence that we need to get in place now. I think we talk about strengthening NATO. I think we have to get NATO troops and U.S. troops on the ground now in the Baltic states, in Poland, and in the Balkans, so that Putin understands that if he goes into those areas, there's a risk of a direct military confrontation with the United States. I think we need to strengthen the capacity of these states to defend themselves, not because they're going to defeat the Russian army, but because they're going to raise the cost to Russia if it does do something. We know from the reactions in Ukraine that there is sensitivity to casualties, that casualties are a problem for Putin politically. We have to make it clear that actually if he tries this, people are going to fight. Then we need to reduce leverage over the long term. We've got to get a new energy policy that reduces Europe's reliance on Russian energy, thereby reduces his leverage. We've got to get the Trade and Investment Pact in place to tie the Europe into a prosperity sphere with the United States. I think these are a number of things which in the short run raise the cost to Russia and to Putin if it should think about this kind of adventurism, and in the long run reduce his leverage. That said, I think at the same time, I'm sounding very hawkish on Russia, I think we have to recognize that Ukraine is a historical and economic problem for Russia. And we need to leave the door open for an arrangement which the best arrangement would be if the EU and the United States, Ukraine, and Russia were to get together and talk about how to stabilize the Ukrainian economy and get it moving in a positive direction. That would be a better neighbor for Russia, actually. But Putin's got to be willing to engage in that kind of conversation. For the moment, I think he's not. Question is, did we miss an opportunity under Yanukovych when the initial discussions about Ukraine joining the EU and Russians said, well, could we be in on this conversation? And the EU said no. Was that a missed opportunity? Don't know. We should leave that door open. But for it to work, Putin will have to walk through it. And for the moment, he doesn't seem to be inclined to do so.
Okay, so now Steve is leading us into what's the proper way to respond. Now, Angela, I want to turn to you, and Steve Biegun, want to bring you in here too. Chancellor Merkel, who's been a very important figure in the Western response, and President Obama made a decision very early on that we weren't going to fight for Ukraine, that there was no legal or ethical obligation for NATO to fight for Ukraine, that instead we'd try to isolate the Russians politically. We would try to build up, as Steve has just described, the NATO position in the Baltic states and Poland as a deterrent device, and that we would drive up the cost through economic sanctions. We've had a couple of rounds of sanctions. They were quite weak, and they were slow to develop until the shoot-down of the Malaysian airliner in mid-July. Then fairly significant sanctions, EU and NATO put forward second week of September. But since then, Angela, the Russians have put more men, more APCs, more tanks across the border into Ukraine. They're clearly intervening against the UN Charter inside Ukraine. Is it now time for the Europeans and Americans and Canadians to say they need to raise the strength of those sanctions?
Well, the challenge is how do you deter and contain Russia in its own neighborhood, right? And you have to start off from the premise, you know, Ukraine is an existential question for the Russians, right? They've defined it as such, and if Ukraine moves west, then this is, detrimental to their own security. It's not an existential question either for the European Union or the United States. And so we've been faced with this asymmetry from the beginning. And then the question is, since there is this asymmetry, and since they're going to care a lot more about this than we do, how do you deter them from going further in what they're doing? And so we've had several rounds of sanctions. They've clearly affected Russia economically. We have people in this room that follow this very closely. The economic situation's deteriorating there. You know, the fall of the ruble, $28 billion in capital flight just in October. We can go on and on. So economically, it's been very detrimental. But instead of leading Russia to maybe step back in this hybrid war, it's redoubled its efforts, even recently. I mean, the Minsk ceasefire agreement of September the 5th is, I won't say it's in tatters, but it's not working very well. You've had, hundreds of casualties. And it's really questionable whether more sanctions, and I guess these sanctions would be tougher sectoral sanctions again, on energy, on the banking system, whether that is going to alter Russian policy there. I think Steve is quite right that the other way you deal with it is you have to build up a credible military posture for those NATO countries, who are our allies, and make sure that Russia doesn't think it can go any further there. It's also, I think, we have to think twice about whether we want to isolate Russia more than we have now. I mean, there's always this calculus. If you isolate, particularly a leader like Vladimir Putin in a situation now where he appears to feel very beleaguered and under attack from the West, I mean, we can argue about that. Is that going to achieve the goal that we want? In other words, we have to really think about what it is we want. Immediately, obviously, we would like Russia to step down, if you like, in eastern Ukraine and to get its separatist allies there to step down as well. But it doesn't even seem to want to do that at the moment. So I think, I'm not sure that tougher sanctions are really going to achieve that goal. I think we probably also need to think about, however difficult it is, opening some kind of back channel, if it's possible, to have someone talk to people in the Kremlin, to Putin. And not that it's easy, and I know there are people around this room, we've been in discussions recently, who would that person be? It's much more difficult now to do this than it was even in the Brezhnev era, certainly in the Gorbachev era. And then, of course, there's the question of whether we step up military assistance to the Ukrainians themselves. So I think we need a mixture of policies going forward, but I think we have to be very careful with the assumption that if we isolate Putin further, this is going to achieve what we want in the longer run.
Thank you very much. So let me ask Steve Biegun, just following up what Angela has said, have the sanctions been effective? Should President Obama and Prime Minister Harper really now push the European Union to a new round of tougher sanctions? And do you think, Steve, that President Obama should offer lethal military assistance to the Poroshenko government so they can defend their territory?
Thank you, Nick. Have the sanctions been effective? The sanctions have been effective in taking a worsening economic performance in Russia and forcing it to a worse state yet. So without a doubt, the Russian economy is feeling the weight of these sanctions. Has it been effective, as in has it changed the behavior of the Russians? No, it has not. So it depends on what your measure of effectiveness is. On the question of of lethal military assistance to Ukraine, absolutely. It's a sovereign, democratically elected government in Europe. They have the right to arm themselves and defend themselves. At the same time, I would strongly discourage the Ukrainians from restarting hostilities. They have to defend themselves, but to initiate hostilities, I don't think they're in a position to achieve any successes on the ground. I think Putin will escalate them, and we're certainly not in a position to engage in that way. So yes, they should have access to all material necessary to defend themselves as a sovereign, democratically elected government. But I don't think hostilities are helpful. But let me also touch on a couple other things I think we have to put in here, and we discussed as a group that have to complete the picture. One is, I emphatically agree with Steve Hadley's point on the essential nature of deterrence with NATO members. If anything were to happen in a NATO member, one of two consequences result. Either we collectively defend the NATO member, and then we do have a worsening crisis, potentially a war in Europe, or we don't, and we see the end of NATO. So either way, there's no good choice for there to be an iota of doubt about what happens. if a NATO member is in any way, shape, or form destabilized. There's an Article 5 guarantee ratified by the United States Senate as a treaty commitment. The United States will meet that commitment, I'm confident. But that doesn't answer the real question, which is the states that aren't in NATO: Moldova, Belarus, Central Asia, South Caucasus. We need much more effective policies to engage these countries, because this is really where the highest likelihood of destabilization occurs. Second, we haven't talked a lot about it on the panel yet, but Ukraine has to be at the center of our policy in Europe. We have to redouble our efforts with the European Union to strengthen the economy and the political stability of Ukraine. Without an economically and politically stable Ukraine, none of this is resolvable. As long as there's a question about Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state, there will be a temptation to affect that future. So we have to get in. We have to get in more closely with Ukraine. We have to resource those policies. And third, and finally, one that I also don't want to leave unspoken, that we have to engage Russia. Yes, we have to deter more problematic behavior, and yes, we have to discourage we have to avoid any reward for what's happening in Ukraine. But we have to engage the Russian government at every possible level. We have to remain engaged with the Russian economy through trade and commerce to strengthen the interdependence between Russia and the outside world, and also, above all, people-to-people contact with the Russians. We have to do everything we can to promote exchanges and continued societal contact. Isolating Russia is not an option for us. It's too big of a country and too important of a country. Isolating behaviors from the Russian government may be a foreign policy priority, but we have to stay engaged with Russia.
Good. So this conversation has taken a very interesting turn, because as we think about, all four of you have talked about how we can construct essentially a containment regime against President Putin and his expansion. I think we're struggling to put all the pieces together, but is it fair to say that on the question of lethal assistance to the Ukrainian government, greater economic assistance that Steve Biegun has talked about, and reinforcing NATO and NATO's position, particularly in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Steve Hadley talked about that, does President Obama now need to go into a new phase of this conflict and do a lot more to build up American policy? Maybe I just ask you all that as a concluding question, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. Strobe.
Let me pick up on something very important that Angela said. Ukraine is an existential issue for Russians, and that's largely at a very human level. The two cultures, the two populations are interwoven in a way that leads many Russians to feel that the independence of Ukraine at the end of 1991 was like having a limb severed, and that they still feel the pain of the severed limb. We in the West do not have that feeling about Ukraine, unless we're Ukrainian Americans or Ukrainian Canadians or that kind of thing. But alongside that, the independence of Ukraine is an existential issue for Ukrainians. And that includes many, many, many Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Steve Pfeiffer, of course, will be speaking, I hope, in the remainder of the conversation. So that leads, I think, into a point that Steve Biegun just made. It is, I think, almost an imperative that when the Ukrainians say to us, the Ukrainian government says to us, we need help in defending ourselves, our state, our forces, and our population from Russian forces that are on our territory and are firing mortars at us and killing us. You have given us, this is according to press reports, the means to identify where those mortars that the Russian forces are using are, but you're not giving us the means to knock out those mortar installations. That should be a no-brainer. It is under debate. And I completely agree with Steve Biegun that debate should be resolved in favor of giving the assistance. The argument against it is that if we give the so-called lethal defensive assistance to the Ukrainians, that will provoke the Russians. hello, the Russians are already rolling, and I think it will have the argument should be just the opposite. If we don't give them the assistance, it will confirm Putin's theory of the case, which is that the West and the United States are weak and going to let him do whatever he wants.
I would just caution, I mean, I agree with most of that, but if we do give them, and we announce that we're giving them lethal defensive weapons, it could then also be an excuse for the Russians to redouble their efforts and to increase their military presence there, and you've already heard sort of hints of that. And I think, therefore, you have to be very careful. You have to think about exactly what kind of equipment it is that you're giving. I would just say one more thing. Going forward, you have to remember that if we don't have our European allies with us on all of this, our own policy is going to be less effective. And, you know, it's been amazing in a way to see the change in Germany, or particularly from Chancellor Merkel and her party, and she's obviously taken the lead in all of this and in trying to get the Europeans behind her. But as someone already said, if you look at Hungary, if you look at some of the East Central European countries, you know, they're softening on some of this. And I think if these facts on the ground continue, the ones in eastern Ukraine, and if you have this, I mean, it's not a successful ceasefire, but that you don't have large-scale hostilities, it will increasingly be used as an excuse in some countries to say, well, things have stabilized, it's maybe not the way that we wanted it, but let's go back and we need to engage Russia, and, you know, our businesses are suffering, our people are suffering from these sanctions, and Europeans are, and let's get rid of the sanctions, because they do, in fact, have an expiration date for the Europeans, at least, of, I believe, next July. So I think going forward, it will, you know, we need to deal with this hybrid warfare, with this undeclared warfare, and I think maybe this is the final thing I'll say. One thing that's very clear from this conflict is there's an information war between Russia and the West. There's no agreement on any of the facts, and in fact, you'll hear from some Russian media barons now saying, well, there's no such thing as facts, really. You know, it's very postmodern. You have your facts, we have our facts. We're at a disadvantage because in Russia, you know, the television channels are mainly controlled by the state, and people get one message. I would just say, as an aside, yesterday I did a 2-hour joint video class with my Georgetown students and students at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and we were polite, but I mean, we had totally different understandings, you know, of what was happening. And I think we need to do better. We in the West, even though obviously we're democracies and we can't tell, you know, TV channels what to say, we need to do a better job of countering this steady stream of non-facts that are coming out of Russia.
Thanks. Steve Hadley and Steve Began, your thoughts on the way forward.
Look, I think the Europe today and the U.S. administration have so many problems and challenges, they just wish this one would go away. And there's a tendency to think, well, we got to do something, so let's do sanctions. You know, we've been in that business. It's kind of easy to do. Everything seems to be more sanctions. The problem is we are not taking the kind of integrated, ambitious strategy we need to solve the problem and prevent it from getting much, much worse. That's the problem. And that requires us to do a lot more than just sanctions. And I think we put a lot of the pieces on the table here, and what we haven't done is integrated it into a strategy that will be effective over the long term, because we are going to be with this for the next 10 years. It's going to be a long-term challenge, and we need to have a integrated strategy that will be robust over time. I think most of the elements we've talked here, let me just say 3 things quickly about it. One, Angela is exactly right. There's an information war going on. We lose it every day. You know, Putin has a great propaganda operation. He has got almost exclusive media control within Russia, and he's doing very well, thank you very much, you've seen it, spreading that view around the globe. We've got to counter it with truth in a very systematic way. We're not even in the game at the moment. Second, if I were in my old job, I would be thinking about lethal assistance, yes, but, you know, this is why you have a CIA. This is why you have covert action. And I would be thinking, do we want to do it explicitly and send a message to Putin? Or do we want to do it covertly? You know, I think, tend now to talk too much and act too little. And sometimes it's good if weapons just start showing up on the battlefield. You know, Putin's doing this to a fairly well. Stuff happens, he denies it. Yeah, you know, I'm all in favor of truth, but sometimes doing things without talking about it is a more effective way to achieve your objectives. Lastly, I think we've got to find a way that we defeat Putin's strategy to create frozen conflicts in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine that freezes these states in the netherworld between the West and Europe and Russia. We've got to say that actually that's not going to stop us, and we're willing to continue to bring these states towards the West, even though they have these unresolved conflicts. That, I think, is very important. Now, we have to do that in the right way. We have to show that we can bring countries west economically and diplomatically without severing economic and ties to the east. We have not thought about it in those terms, and I think if we can step this crisis down, it might be a way over the long term to find a way out if Putin at some point decides he wants one.
Steve Biegun, your final thoughts before we move to the audience.
Sure. Two last things. One is that we should inventory what our own strengths are here. And you've heard some of them here. We have a strong alliance. It can be stronger, but we have a strong alliance. We have an economy that's faced its own challenges, but we still have the wherewithal to lead a significant economic effort to stabilize Ukraine. We have the attraction of a rules-based democratic society that uses the market to deliver economic opportunity to its citizens. These are our strengths, and we need to fall back on our strengths. So that's the first thing. Second, and by the way, patience. We need to act, but we need to be thoughtful and patient. The other thing is we can't delay. Can't delay. We can't wait. I suspect, having with Steve served in an administration that had more than its share of national security challenges around the world, that there's a certain fatigue at this point in the Obama administration that's likely taking over. And with 2 years left, the thought of spending any significant time or political capital on the brief of Russia is probably pretty unappetizing to people. I think there very well could even be a view that this is one that's going to be left for the next president. But these next 2 years are critically important. We cannot be asleep on this set of issues, because only worse can come from it. So my other word of concern or advice to the current administration is make this the highest possible priority. It's got to be a high priority.
Steve, thank you. I want to open up this conversation to all of you. I would just suggest, if you'd like to speak, just put your name tent up. We'll call on as many people as we can. We've got, 37 minutes left. Perhaps I want to bring in first Steve Pfeiffer and Jim Collins, because what they did in their ambassadorships was, of course, directly related to what we're talking about. Steve, I want to start with you. And the question I have for you is, can Ukraine be helped? And it's what Steve Biegun was talking about. If there's a major European Union, and North America, and Canada will be a big part of this effort to sustain them economically. Here's a country with massive corruption, almost a failed state, poor governance. Most of us on this side of the table have been dealing with them since December '91, and they're hard to help. Based on your personal experience, you were the American ambassador. If Steve Biegun gets his way and we've got a major expansion of aid, will it do any good?
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you for a very good panel, which I think has outlined a lot of the pieces of the problem and some of the parts of the solution or the policy response. Let me take a crack at that question, then I want to offer one other comment on Vladimir Putin and Russia. No, I think if there's going to be a solution to this crisis, ultimately you've got to find a way to get Ukraine economically stable. They've got to be able to get into a very different situation from where they are today. And that's going to require additional credits and resources from the West in large amounts. But I think before the United States and the European Union consider that, they need to make sure that the Ukrainians do the necessary steps in terms of adopting the necessary reforms in the energy sector, the economic sector, anti-corruption. Ukrainians have to take the steps that they have not taken for the last 20 years to get their economy right. And if they don't, we can throw lots of money at it, and it's not going to fix the situation. And I guess I'd come back to say, Ukraine is in this very weak and vulnerable situation. The single biggest reason that Ukraine is in this situation today is for the past 23 years, Ukrainian leaders have made bad decisions. They've avoided reforms because they've been fearful of the political consequences. Understandable. If you're going to raise the price of energy for everybody in the country, that has a negative political consequence. But as a result, as Anders can explain, they have a completely crazy energy system now, which is just creates huge opportunities for corruption, and it's put them in this hole. And in some cases, unfortunately, you've had leaders who put personal interest. I think the previous president, Mr. Yanukovych, was a prime example. He was much more interested in personal wealth and corruption than he was in what was good for the country. But Ukrainian leaders have to take the decisions now, and if they don't, it's going to be a country that will be beyond the ability of the West to help. The second question on our, point I'd like to make on Vladimir Putin, and I think the panel's made really good comments on both his sense of grievance, the idea that now that he has resources, he can push back. But I wonder about his understanding of things outside Russia. And what triggered this was Steve Hadley's comment about this idea that maybe Putin thinks that at some way he can get Ukraine back in 3 or 4 years. And I think actually Putin at one level may believe that. And that's totally divorced from reality. I was in Kyiv about 2 months ago, and the most stunning thing, the biggest thing that has changed since I was there back in the 1990s was this sense of a Ukrainian national identity. I mean, Ukraine and Kyiv is awash in blue and yellow. Flags everywhere, people painting the national colors everywhere. And an unfortunate part of this national identity, though, is I think there's a very strong anti-Russian element. I think Putin has lost a generation of Ukrainians, and it's not, as one Ukrainian said to me, he goes, it's not just anti-Putin, he said it's anti-Russian, because we've seen for the last 7 months what the Russians have done and what Putin has done, and the Russians haven't spoken out against it. Now, in the long term, I don't think that's healthy, because Russia and Ukraine are neighbors, that's not going to change. But it gets to this question, though. I mean, if Putin, everything he's done in the last 7 months has pushed the Ukrainian people away, but this idea then that somehow he thinks he can get them back in 3 or 4 years, it really does raise in my mind a question, does he really understand what's going on in Ukraine and outside the borders of Russia?
Steve, thank you. I want to turn to Ambassador Jim Collins, who was the American ambassador in Russia, but also served in previous times of his career, a longtime Russia expert. And Jim, the question I want to ask you is Angela's suggestion that at a time of crisis that the United States should have some kind of effective channel to Putin so that we can talk and we can listen. And I ask this because at our Aspen Strategy Group meeting, and if you read the book, I think all of us to a person agreed that we had to oppose Putin in Ukraine, but keep a channel open to him on Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, counterterrorism, and the Middle East. Do you agree with Angela's suggestion for a channel, and how do you view sustaining a relationship with Russia on all those other global issues where it is an important actor?
Well, before I answer that, let me just underscore my agreement with Steve. That if we really look at what's at stake with Ukraine at the moment, it's going to be economic. They have, Anders can perhaps speak to this better than I can, but it's certainly my impression that there is a massive requirement for funding them to get them through the coming year or two. And that is only going to be effective if they get their act together politically, frankly. Now, I think the second point Steve made is a very good one. The great thing Putin has done for Ukraine in the last year is essentially to unite Ukraine, at least in not accepting what Russia is doing to them. Now, maybe that gives hope that we will get a better result this time than we have every time we've had this problem for the last 20-some years. I have my fingers crossed. But it's going to mean serious money from the European Union and the United States if they do the right thing and then have the wherewithal to make something of themselves. So far as Mr. Putin is concerned, a couple of points. Number one, I find it very unfortunate that we have so personalized all of this. I've been back and forth to Moscow quite a bit, and one of the things I have to say is that it's not just Mr. Putin who is thinking in these terms. And therefore, we can't delude ourselves that simply talking to Mr. Putin is going to solve the problem. And the problem basically, forget about who's guilty and what we didn't do or did do right. The problem is that the Euro-Atlantic security system isn't working to resolve this issue at this point. And so whatever we may think is right, wrong, indifferent, or whatever, the question is, how do we get ourselves out of this mess? Now, I happen to agree very much with Steve Hadley in this. I mean, I think there are things that are within our control, if you will, as the alliance or the United States, that we can do without really having much recourse to thinking through how we deal with the other side in this equation. So we can strengthen the forces in places like the Baltics or in Poland. We can do other things within the alliance. We can take measures that, in some sense, give confidence that we are not going to be pushed by the Russians and there is a line they better not cross. He gets that. Putin is no fool. And he knows he's playing a weak hand, frankly. The second thing, it seems to me, is I do think we need to find a way to engage him. The real problem here is we largely are not asking the right question, in my view. Because I think we need to go to Mr. Putin and say, look, we have a mess on our hands. What's your idea about how we get out of this? Because I don't think Mr. Putin has the answer either of how he's not going to lose or how he's going to win at the moment. My sense, he has a tar baby on his hand in eastern Ukraine at the moment. You know, does he go all the way to Kiev? I don't think that's a viable idea, frankly. I don't think he's got the capability, first of all. And so there's a lot of bluff in this. But it doesn't seem that East Ukraine has ended up sort of producing the groundswell of support for his idea that I think he thought was going to come, just as he thought it did in Crimea. So now he's got a problem. And I'd say the time to talk to him is when he thinks he's got a problem, and I think he probably understands he does. So, I mean, my suggestion would be to find a way, and I think it has to be from President Obama, to go to him and put on the table the question, well, what are we going to do to get ourselves out of this mess? It's not in your interest. It's not in ours. Neither of us can afford to see Ukraine go belly up economically or in other ways. It won't benefit anybody. So what do we do? And the second thing I think that I would say about our policy that really is very troubling to me is that in many ways the sort of mood of that's taking hold in the United States and in much of Europe about isolating Russia is precisely playing Putin's game. Putin's narrative is we are under siege. The forces in Washington, orchestrated by President Obama, are trying to destroy Russia, weaken it, isolate it, undercut it. And what you've created is a sense that we're validating his line of argument. There are tremendous numbers of Russian institutions, individuals, groups in society and the private sector who want none of this idea of isolating Russia and Putin's idea that self-isolation is the answer. So I'm very concerned when we are the ones who cut exchange programs or don't encourage all those people who have a stake in the relationship with the United States and Europe by cutting off their own capacity to conduct that relationship. And unfortunately, we've done too much of that. Some of it's just budgetary, some of it's political, some of it is just because people are smelling the way the wind's blowing in this country as well as they do in Moscow. I think we need to find a way to encourage, as much as we can, the building of the ties among those who see the relationship with the United States and Europe as a central part of Russia's future.
Jim, thank you. I think what I'd like to do is have a few more people just offer thoughts or ask questions, then ask our panel to respond to it. Madam Ambassador, I know that you would like to speak. If any country understands Russia, it's Finland. And a Finnish perspective would be welcome. And then after you speak, Madam Ambassador, I was going to ask Marvin Kalb to offer his thoughts as well.
Thank you very much for giving me a word. And thank you very much for a very informative and good panel also. And thank you for including us. A couple of things actually. I would have asked one of the issues that I have a feeling that that Putin is only listening at US, sort of wanting parity in a sense. And you were, Ambassador Collins, you were mentioning that it's President Putin he is obviously listening. So, and in the discussion was that actually this government is at the moment sort of a petty fatigue, maybe on the issue. So, how would you make it then that your president is sort of having a dialogue with President Putin on that? And then what would be the agenda? Because I think that we have, if you really closely read the Putin's agenda, and you know it much better than I do, I'm just generalist diplomat, that he has been repeatedly saying his agenda also, and that includes very much of the sphere of interests, a certain kind of dominance in some of the areas. He feels still very much lost. So what would be? I would imagine that when you have a dialogue, there is always one seeks to have compromises on some of the issues. What would be those compromises? Do you would like to that? And then the other one is that so maybe I leave here actually, because the Article 5, I think still the Article 5 issue for challenging the NATO actually at the moment, and especially the Article 5 is something which needs very close attention during coming months. And we have seen several activities, of course, increased activities globally also, that we are not only the NATO members, but also active partners with NATO are challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. One of the questions that we worked on in the Bush administration was trying to draw closer to Sweden and Finland, not members of NATO, but certainly partners that have a big interest in stability in your part of Europe. Marvin, since I've read your book, I know that you've been watching the Russians for at least 50 years. I'm sorry to date you. How do you see all this, and what's your toughest question for this panel?
Well, I want to pick up a thought that Angela started with and Strobe supported, and that is that for Russia, Ukraine is an existential problem. For the United States, it does not appear to be an existential problem. Therefore, when you talk about sending, as Senator McCain has begun to talk about, as the new chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, about sending lethal weapons to Ukraine, the question then comes up, over many decades now, that the United States has been involved in one war after another without a clear definition to itself and for itself about in what way does an American military involvement satisfy the direct national security interest of this country. When Ukraine and the support of Ukraine can somehow address that central issue, how is it in the direct security interests of this country that we go to the extent of providing lethal military assistance? That would be my question.
Let me ask the panelists, who would like to respond both to the ambassador but also to Marvin? Steve, the question from the ambassador of Finland is, if President Putin and President Obama were able to achieve a consistent dialogue, what would be the agenda? And what's the purpose of that?
It's very difficult. One of the problems is President Putin's information sources. You know, Angela Merkel said he's living in a different world, and some people read that to sort of think he was sort of lost his mind. This is a very shrewd, tough guy, but I worry about his information sources, which are very much in the hands of the intelligence services, and I'm not convinced they give him a accurate and true picture of what's happening in the world, and that they feed a lot of instincts and biases. And one of the things you have to, when you serve a president, you have to be careful about feeding his biases rather than giving him information. So one of the problems is, how do you get through them? You know, President Poroshenko was here, and he says, you know, it's a problem. Every time I talk to Putin, I'm talking to a different Putin, and I have to sort of spend, after 2 or 3 hours, I can get him to begin to understand, and maybe I can get some movement out of him. But then when I don't talk to him for a week, you know, it's back sort of believing his own propaganda. So this is a very difficult guy to manage at this time. Second, why do we focus on Putin? One, it's because he's, so far as we can tell, really the only decision maker. He's not talking to anybody. He's not listening to Lavrov or anybody else. And true, he's reflecting opinion, but he is also manufacturing opinion in Russia through propaganda and all the rest. So that's why we keep talking about Putin, because he is, I think, a key to doing this. Third, what is the agenda? You know, got to be careful about this one, but someone said to me once that one of the problems with Putin is Putin would sit with American presidents and explain things, and an American president would say, great, you know, we're Americans, we fix things, I'll go fix it. And Putin said to this person, I didn't want the president to fix it. I wanted him to understand. Now, that's a very interesting comment. And so I think what we need is, if there is an envoy, it's not to talk about how to retain cooperation, Iran and other things. They'll do that, I think, for their own issues. I think it's a special envoy, go to him, who can sit down with him and say, I'm prepared to sit here and hear everything you have to say, because I want to try to understand where we are, because this is a problem that needs to be fixed, and we need to see if there's a way to fix it. That's how I'd start. It would be a very unfocused agenda. It would be spending a lot of time and doing a lot of listening. I went to Ariel Sharon in 2005, 2003, and said, the president sent me to hear everything you have to say about settlements, and I'm supposed to stay here until you've told me everything you think he needs to understand to know your view about settlements. And he said, interesting, no one's ever asked me before. And we then spent 4 days and 13 hours with him, and at the end of the day, I knew a lot about what he thought about settlements. But it began to build the basis of trust. We're late in the day with Putin, but I don't see any other way to do it, and I think that's where you start.
Just one brief thing on the agenda. I mean, we all know, right, ultimately, it's already been said, the Euro-Atlantic security architecture that was created in the 1990s was created in such a way that Russia does not have a stake in it, and really never had a stake in it. And that's something that we do have to address, right? That's the fundamental issue, and therefore, if you take away everything about New World Order, it's not a New World Order, but it is a question of how do we regulate that better so that we don't have Russia then deciding it can violate, you know, the sovereignty of Ukraine. But in order to get there, right, you have to take a number of smaller and larger steps because, you know, the last time this came up, when President Medvedev in 2008 presented his plan for European security, everyone said, we don't want another Helsinki-type conference. We've had one of those. We don't need it. Well, I think now we probably understand we need something else. So I think that, but that's the end, it's not the end of that's the big agenda item. But in order to get there, obviously, other steps have to be taken, including restoring at least, you know, what's left of Ukraine's territorial integrity.
I'm going to just take the prerogative of the chair just briefly to, with great respect, just disagree slightly with Angela about whether we gave Russia a stake in the security architecture. We created the NATO-Russia Council in the spring of 2002 to bring Russia into the heart of NATO in Brussels. And I know that President Bush was serious, and Secretary Colin Powell at the time were serious about giving them a stake. Let's plan strategically for how to safeguard security in Europe, and let's bring you, Russia, into some of our peacekeeping missions. And I can say it because I'm outside of government. Ambassador Sergei Kislyak turned it into a debating society. He wasn't serious. So I just think we gave them their chance at a critical moment post 9/11.
But we
Feel
probably
free to
need to give,
respond.
I mean, I agree with you, and they never took it very seriously, but we probably need to give them another chance. That doesn't mean that they're going to take it, and that, but I think we're at a point now where the system is broken.
I just wanted to come back to a couple of comments that Jim Collins made. And by the way, Jim Collins has been not just one of the best colleagues and friends I've had, but also a mentor in my own interest in Russia over the years. And I think the most important thing he said was to underscore the stupidity of isolation being the overall goal of U.S. policy. It has to be a nuanced combination of, guess what? Containment. Containment is the right word, and engagement, and including diplomatic engagement. Where, Jim, I'm a little bit skeptical is on your pushback against the personalization of this around Putin. I think it deserves to be personalized. I think it's a defensible proposition that Putin is the most powerful Kremlin leader since Joseph Stalin. He's not as powerful as Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin had some administrative techniques at his hand that put him in a whole different league. But every Kremlin leader since then has either had to report to a Politburo as a kind of a board of directors that could fire him, as they did with Khrushchev, or Yeltsin, who had political weaknesses of his own. And my guess is if we could find the perfect envoy, like maybe you, to go talk to Putin, what he would say in one word is, let's do Minsk. And what he would do in one word is, let's do Donetsk. In other words, he is playing a double game, and he's getting away with it, and he will continue to play the double game as long as he gets away with it, and we've got to keep him from getting away with it.
Okay, if there are two frontline states in this conflict, they are Latvia and Estonia, two NATO allies who deserve and have the protection of Article 5. And we have the two ambassadors here, and they both want to speak. So maybe I'll start, Mr. Ambassador, with you, the Estonian perspective, and then Mr. Ambassador, the Latvian perspective.
Thank you, Nick, and I want to thank all panelists. And I think you have contributed a lot personally, all of you, to the achievements of these 100 million people in the region. We celebrate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall, and I want to say a word of appreciation to all of you. And I know what you have done. And I appreciate your thoughts today as well. I think that I have few comments and one question. I think where we are today, it's not just bad weather, it's a climate change. So it's really difficult to reverse the climate change, as we all know. We have bad news, but also good news, I would say. The bad news everybody knows. I'm not going to repeat those. And the question is really, what are the important issues that we have to tackle right now? And I think few points that are important from our perspective. Probably first and foremost, the transatlantic link. The synchronicity of the United States and Europe. It's not only European allies, NATO allies, but also European Union. I think we see this really the effect of that transatlantic unity when it comes to the sanctions. And this is one area where I probably disagree with the sense that I got from the panel that sanctions are not working. I think they are working. They are really changing the whole atmosphere inside Russia, inside the leadership. But we need time. And it could be a long time, but we should be ready, and we should continue with the sanctions. I think that what really came as a shock to the Russian leadership was the very united front that EU had in August and September while putting forward the sanctions. So long-term readiness to continue. One issue that was brought up, energy security and kind of getting us or the region, actually whole Europe, out of the Russian energy kind of influence. I think we see lots of things happening in this regard, but that takes time as well. It takes probably 5 to 10 years to see real results. But this is a very important issue, so that in 10 years' time, we can diversify from Russian gas and oil and say, well, you can't use this as a political tool anymore. Third point, or fourth point, is the presence of allies in the territories. And Nick, you said the frontline countries like us is very important. And we have good news here too. I think that, the United States sent troops to the region 3 days after Crimea was invaded. Now, what has happened in the past 6 months, in that sense, the American engagement and NATO engagement, also European allies in the region, is more than we have been waiting for the past 6 years since Georgia crisis. Now it's happening. We have 1st Cavalry Division in the region. We have a very, we see that the administration is working on the European Reassurance Initiative that will go to Congress soon. We want to see that to become sustainable and long-term, not just 1 or 2 financial years issue. We see that NATO is really thinking very deeply on what to do in the region. The Wales Summit results, you all know. Now we have to implement those, and I see a very clear political willingness from the also European allies to implement the decisions set forward in Wales. But my question really is, and I think this is crucial, that what we lack is the strategic vision, and that was a little bit talked about here too. But my question is, how do we achieve that strategic vision, and what that strategic vision should contain really? Because what we talk about here is and what sometimes we lack in our debate is that what do we really defend? It's not the specific countries or people that NATO is defending, but it's the values. It's the Western values that we defend. We have to be very straightforward in defending these values. And I feel that sometimes that debate is missing when we talk about what the Western strategic vision should be. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. What's going to happen? We don't have a lot of time left. I think we're going to go into extra innings, if you're a baseball fan, or extra time, if you're a global football fan. So if I could just ask maybe just a couple of people to weigh in, starting with you, Ambassador, Anders, Mike, and then I would, if there are brief comments and questions, I could ask each of the 4 panelists to answer whatever aspect of this they'd like to answer, whatever final points they'd like to make. And Ambassador, I know that NATO put on a great air show yesterday when the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited Tallinn, there was a significant display of NATO air power. The Wall Street Journal covered it in their front page today. Does that help, that symbolic show of support?
Well, thanks so much, really, Nick, and thanks so much, organizers, for this terrific discussion, strategic discussion. I think we're missing these kind of discussions in Washington a little bit, especially when we try to put somehow together a good agenda for next EU partnership, Eastern Partnership Summit in Riga in May. Neither EU nor perhaps here in the US we have kind of strategic, clear vision how to act, what to do in our region. And I fully support what Eric just mentioned on well, we have, of course, it's symbolism, but besides symbolism, there is very practical stuff going on right now and very serious stuff that we haven't seen since perhaps Peter the Great opened the window to Europe in our region, but it's happening right now, and that keeps us I think, more or less calm when it comes to developments in our region. I just wanted to say that very short point and then a question. I think Ukraine definitely, to my understanding, is extremely important strategically. Either we fail or we do more or less things right. I still believe that it's possible to do things right in Ukraine, but we are missing 3 points in Ukraine today. One, Ukraine doesn't have a chance to defend itself. I think that's important that Ukraine has this ability. The second is that Ukraine economically is very weak. Of course, Ukraine needs assistance, but Ukraine as well a little bit reminds me a failed state today. If we provide this assistance in a very fast way, it doesn't mean that it will help. But it would be, I think, a mistake to wait until Ukraine goes through the reform process and then provide assistance. I think those two parts should go somehow hand in hand, something what we have seen during the 90s when we approached EU membership. And the third point is one very important piece what Ukraine is missing in current situation, it's EU perspective. When we went through the process of joining EU, these reforms really were very painful, very costly. Politicians were afraid of them. Public very often didn't understand, didn't have a clue what politicians have been doing for Ukrainian government to prove that these reforms would really make a difference without, well, kind of strategic clarity. It's a problem. For that, I hope we'll be able to do something at the summit in Riga. But, well, perhaps for Russia, Ukraine is an existential question. But developments in Ukraine are unfolding in a phone of as well developments what we can see in Europe. Nationalism or growing nationalism, it's not only the problem of Russia today. What we can see, the things are a little bit happening as well in other parts of Europe. And at some point, either we fail or do things right in Ukraine might become as well existential for one or another European. Not necessarily Baltic states. Just a few days ago, Angela Merkel, she stated that Ukraine, that's a problem for Europe in general. It's not only a regional problem. And my question goes to the point what Angela said on information warfare. Apparently, we are losing here. What we can do not to lose?
Mike and Anders, if I could maybe just ask you very brief questions so that the four panelists can then sum up. Mike Hulsel.
Well, thank you, Nick. I'd like to get straight to the information warfare and to stress what other people have said, that the historical revisionism that Putin first enunciated at the Wehrkunde meeting in Munich in 2007 just simply doesn't hold up for most of the 1990s. And here I'd like to underscore what Strobe said, but from a congressional perspective in this case. After the first war in Chechnya, the Russians asked for a revision of the so-called flank document. This is esoterica today. The Russians have withdrawn from the CFE. But the fact is this was after the war, and we wanted to strengthen the incipient democracy, let's say, of Yeltsin. The vote in the U.S. Senate, because it was a treaty ratification amendment, was 100-0. I mean, this is, it was very, very significant. Second, very quick point, in March of '97, then Senator Biden and I went to Moscow on a fact-finding trip having to do with NATO enlargement, but we went to Russia first, which tells you something. Yeltsin had been at the summit in Helsinki just a day or two before. He was described as indisposed in the suburbs, but we met with just about everybody else we wanted to, including the most important meeting was with his national security staff in the Kremlin late at night. We talked about details of possible enlargement, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. Were they happy about it? No, they felt wounded. Were they the slightest bit worried? Not in the slightest. Was there any talk that there had been a promise that we would never do this? No. By the end of the discussion, we were talking about if Russia continued on its current trajectory, could it someday join NATO? So that's it. One last very final point having to do with the lethal defensive weapons, the Ukraine. The decision's going to happen sooner rather than later. There are at least 2 bipartisan bills in Congress right now, and unless I'm speed read incorrectly, at Tony Blinken's confirmation hearing yesterday for your old job, Strobe, he said that the administration felt that it was about time that we furnish them. So I guess my question, if it was just, what are the implications for our relations with Russia and with our European allies if that does go through?
Thanks, Mike. And Anders, if you can ask your question in 60 seconds or less, we'll get 2 extra copies of this book. The Aspen book.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. Ukraine, of course, is in the center, and I wanted to add a sense of urgency here simply. The Ukrainian economy will melt down within 4 months if nothing seriously is done very fast. What Ukraine needs to do on its side is to unify the energy prices and cut 10% of GDP, what the Baltic countries did in 2009. It's a serious reform. And what the West needs to put up is a package in the order of $30 billion on top of the $17 billion of IMF money for the next 5 or 6 years. Thank you.
Well done. We'll deliver the extra copies to your institute. Let me ask each of the panelists to wrap up whatever they'd like to say on all the issues. But Steve, we'll start with you. And it's Anders' comment about a $30 billion Western assistance package speaks directly to what your major point was.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anders. In fact, Anders has written 2 pieces in the last 2 weeks which lay out what the Western response should be and what the Ukrainians have responsibility for. And I commend him for these excellent pieces. They're available on the Peterson Institute website. So let me just say that I agree with every word that he's written. I do want to answer Marvin Kolb and Mike Holzel's point about lethal military assistance. First of all, with the caveat that the less this is talked about, the better. But here we are. Second, there are the how, the what, the through what means. Steve Hadley suggested some things. Are we talking about the grant of military assistance? Are we talking about licensing, sales? There's a whole variety of policy questions therein. But let's just take it at its most basic level, helping Ukraine strengthen its military capabilities. Now, if the United States is engaged in that process, we will have more influence with the Ukrainian government on what exactly they do with those capabilities. But let me take the counterfactual, which is that to leave the Ukrainian government weak, whether it's economically or defensively, does not seem to me to suggest an outcome that's going to be better. So to Marvin Kolb's question that we have to think long and hard about whether or not Ukraine is something we want to go to war over, I can answer that question. We do not. Absolutely do not. The question is, what makes it more or less likely that we get drawn into those circumstances? That a sovereign, democratically elected government in Europe would be denied the means of self-defense, to me is an extremely suspicious presumption, and it's one that the United States should certainly not support.
Thanks, Steve Began. Steve Hadley.
I'll make some quick points. There's what I call the Vietnam conceit, that if only the United States had the right policies, all would be right with the world. We don't have that kind of power and influence. And the truth is, Russia is different today because of its own internal domestic realities, largely independent or, in some cases, in spite of the policies we pursued. Russia is a different place today than it was 10, 15 years ago. It is true that there's no military solution to these kinds of problems, but there's also no solution that does not have a military element. And that needs to be NATO and U.S. forces, not air forces, but ground forces, people on the ground. That's what gets attention. And it needs to be assistance to these countries to help defend themselves. I would do it covertly rather than overtly, but it needs to be done. On the economic piece, the problem that came out in our Aspen strategy group is for every move we make economically, Putin has two counters, or Russia has two counters. They have much more influence, and this is what is tricky. How can we make Ukraine an economic success if actually Russia is working to make it a basket case? This is tough. Steve Pfeiffer may be right, I hope he's right, but I sometimes wonder how far Kiev's writ runs in a country and whether at some point it might break up under the kind of pressure it is under. I love this. It's not bad weather, but climate change, and it's hard to reverse climate change. I think we need to find a way to get some people talking about what, stepping back and look at how Russia has changed, how Europe has changed, and what is a vision going forward. Because we're in new territory. And I worry that we're doing too much tactically and not stepping back and trying to really look strategically at where we are and where we want to be and how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Angela.
Thank you. I'll just address 2 points. On the question of information warfare, I mean, we're always going to be at a disadvantage in any democratic country because we don't speak with one voice. But I think we should do a better job, we in Europe and the US, of just putting the facts out there. I mean, there's still too many news outlets that say, people use the word incursion of what the Russians are doing, or it's alleged that there are Russian troops there, or it's alleged that Russian, tanks and equipment is going there. We know this stuff. We have the proof, and we should be more, and I know that there's some people who don't want to do that because then you get into the question of how you know that. But we have to, I think, be more upfront about, undeniable, incontrovertible facts, of which there are some. And I would include the MH17 crash, because if you have the misfortune, as I do sometimes, to read the Russian blogs and see all the stuff that they've put out about that, including, just very recently, I mean, we understand what happened, and I think that has to be, to the extent that it's possible, to have that out there with no ifs, ands, or buts. So that's, I think, where you start there. And my second point is sort of goes to the longer-term question of, some of my Russian colleagues have said what you're seeing now in Russia as part of this reaction to what's happening and the things that Putin is saying. It's not only that Russia's putting itself forward as a model, the new conservative international, appealing to traditional states with, traditional family values, but it's a revolt against modernity. And Steve, you said obviously we all understand that what Russia needs to do is to build the institutions of a modern 21st century state. What Putin is doing, a lot of what he's saying, is appealing to those people who are actually afraid of that, or who fear it, and who sort of don't want to be in the 21st century. So if Putin's in power for another 10 years, as is quite likely, we have to think about who are the next generation? Who are the people who are going to be coming in to power at some point when he's no longer in the Kremlin? We don't really know those people, and it's hard to see, but we have to do everything that we can while we're still dealing with this particular crisis to build up, longer term and continual contacts with hopefully the next generation of people who do not fear modernity.
Thank you very much. Strobe, you get the last word.
No, I think actually Ambassador Marmé is going to get the last word, because his climate change wisecrack, which is terrific, is going to be out there trending. I bet it's already trending in the Twitterverse. It's I can't wait till I can get at my iPhone and help that. I just want to pick up on something that Angela just said, which I think goes to the meta point here. She and I, we're sitting together almost every day, it seems, on this subject. She made the very good point that the Russian word for security, bezopasnost, means absence of danger. So if we want to empathize, if we want to be Putin understanders, we need to understand where he sees the danger coming from. He sees the danger coming from the West. That's the only point of the compass from which the danger is not coming to Russia. What Russia needs, and what we want Russia to see that it needs, is basically the following: a modern economy, a modern globalized economy, and not being the poster child for the resource curse. A healthy population, which it doesn't have. An open society, which it doesn't have. And since it's got 14 contiguous neighbors, it should have 14 friendly neighbors. In fact, what Putinism is doing is inspiring or engendering fear and loathing in 13 of those 14, and as for the 14th, and we know who that is, loathing, but aspirations for Russian territory. That's what these future leaders, we have to hope, will recognize, and he doesn't, and probably never will.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who is here, and I hope that for all of you in the room, and certainly for those watching on C-SPAN, people believe they've seen an objective, serious, nonpartisan discussion of important issues, because that's what the Aspen Strategy Group is about, nonpartisan discussions. And if you'd like to know more, I would say to the C-SPAN audience, The Crisis with Russia, Aspen Strategy Group book, available on Amazon.com. Thanks very much to all the panelists. Thanks to the ambassadors of Finland and of Denmark and Estonia and of Latvia. Thanks very much for being here.